we're back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Hey, remember Donald Trump? Of course you do, because sadly he has not gone away. And if you remember the presidency of Donald Trump, as tragically we all do, you will know that the music industry and entertainment, the arts in general, played a huge role, maybe an unprecedented role in resisting the presidency of Donald Trump. And that's the topic of my next guest's book. I always look forward to speaking with him. Danny Goldberg is, well, let's see, how do I describe him? He's a music impresario, he's a political activist, and he's an author. He's written several books, of which the latest is our topic now. The book is Bloody Crossroads 2020, Art, Entertainment, and Resistance to Trump. So, Danny, welcome back to the program.
Hey, nice to see you.
Great to see you. And, you know, this is an obvious first question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What prompted you to write this book?
I've had a long interest in the relationship between art and politics. First, when I was a teenager growing up during the Vietnam War, I was influenced by movies like Dr. Strangelove or some of Phil Oakes' songs, among others. Then later on, in the late 79, I was in the music business, and a PR client of mine named John Hall, who was in the band Orleans, became obsessed with the environmental and health hazards of nuclear power. And through that conversation, I ended up with a friend of mine making a movie called No Nukes about that covered several concerts that Jackson Browne, Springsteen, Doobie Brothers, Bonnie Raitt, Gil Scott-Heron, and others did at Madison Square Garden to raise money for grassroots groups that were involved with that struggle. And that was the moment when I realized that there was a connective tissue between kind of what had been my private political ideas and what I was doing for a living, working with artists. And over the decades, I worked with a lot of creative people on different causes. As the chair of the ACLU in Southern California, I got to see up close the so-called liberal Hollywood of that period, people like Barbra Streisand and Warren Beatty and Jane Fonda, Alfre Woodard and others. And then when Trump got elected, I noticed this tremendous and immediate broadening and intensification of the engagement of the creative community in trying to be part of what was loosely called the resistance. Part of that was the racist and sexist nature of the campaign. Part of it, I feel, was because he himself was a product of Hollywood. He was the host for 14 years of a primetime television show, The Apprentice, so-called reality television, and people in the arts and show business know that reality television has very little to do with actual reality. And it just seemed to me like an interesting thing to focus on as the election was coming up. And I also, frankly, just as a writer, like the idea of covering and researching something in real time instead of going back into the past. That was a new experience for me. So the bulk of the book focuses on 2020, the election year, and kind of granular detail, just cherry picking hundreds of incidents of political art and political activism. The two things are quite separate, but yet they're intertwined. And just trying to curate that in a way that represented this sort of other campaign that was going on, because I just think that so many times the way the political media covers politics is through a very narrow lens. I don't blame them for that. They have their job to do, but what's really going on in the country are a lot of other conversations that don't fit into the typical 24-hour news cycle. And, I in the introduction, I quote an article Norman Mailer wrote in anticipating John Kennedy's election in 1960, where he said that American politics ran on two tracks. One was the external, what he said, boring but important granular politics, and the other what he called the subterranean river of emotion that represents the dream life of a nation. So I knew there were going to be other campaign books about the external campaign that would cover the debates and the talking points and the fundraising and the TV spots. And I thought it would be interesting to try to cover how the subterranean river engaged Trump because of and to me that subterranean river, the dream life, is particularly connected with art and entertainment, because that's also what art and entertainment addresses, is the unconscious, the emotions, the mysterious things that motivate people to do one thing or another politically, or to sit out political things. So, and then lockdown happened, so I had a lot of time on my hands, so I was able to get it finished, and it just was published last week, 1 year after the election.
Well, so many interesting things about this, Danny Goldberg, and one of them for me is I had never thought until just now, actually, when you were speaking about the fact that because Trump was himself an entertainment figure, that, and those of us who know that there were battles over credit for the writers on reality TV shows, which tells you they're not really reality, that in fact that this arts and entertainment resistance to Trump, in a way, it was an internecine battle. It was all the field of battle was media, was entertainment, and this subconscious backdrop. You get what I'm saying?
It certainly wasn't the granular detail of legislation. I wish it was, because I think to the extent people know about what's really in these different laws, they end up on the progressive side. I don't have to tell you. I know you work with Bernie Sanders, that if you poll, he's constantly tweeting about the fact that if you poll any of the elements in the so-called Build Back Better Act, whether it's family leave or things like higher minimum wage, you've been left out of it, or lower prescription drug prices, get 75% support from the public, yet through the mystery of tribalism and brainwashing and ignorance, those same people are 30 points less enthusiastic about the person who's proposing them at any given time.
Right.
Right wing, it's paradoxical, because historically and recently, the big majority of people in the arts veer to the left. I would say 75% probably. There are some right-wing artists, and I acknowledge them in the book, whether it was John Voight or Kanye West or so on, or historically some of what Clint Eastwood has done. But obviously Ayn Rand, who's the queen of the libertarian philosophy, attained that status because of novels, because of her fiction. But in general, art and entertainment veers to the left. That cliche of liberal Hollywood is true. The people in the creative community are mostly progressive or liberal. Yet it's the right wing who's harnessed the tools of emotional communication, first with Ronald Reagan, then with Donald Trump. They elected 2 presidents that way. They are much more aggressive on social media. And they are much more populist in the way they communicate with people. And for whatever reason, the left and the Democrats have been weak in that area. They're more wonky. They're more, doing things that might be expressed in an op-ed in the New York Times, but that don't reach, the 90% of the people who don't read things like the New York Times. And one of the few tools that the left has is the entertainment community. Now, even though that's not an organized community, artists inherently are individualist and they do things their own way. They're not going to stick to talking points. But still, the overwhelming response to Trump from that community, I think, was part of the story in 2020. When Jon Stewart started hosting The Daily Show in 1999, he was the only one combining comedy and politics on a nightly basis. After Trump, it was every show, every night. In previous decades, the big pop icons, the musical stars with the mass audiences, people in the old days, in previous decades, like Whitney Houston or Mariah Carey, Justin Timberlake, even Madonna, who occasionally would weigh in on gay rights, were very, very limited or totally silent in political engagement. In the Trump era, the biggest pop stars, Taylor Swift, Cardi B, Demi Lovato, were all out there day after day commenting. And I think they represented kind of on Twitter one of the few answers to the right wing and Trumpist talking points that could reach that many people. when Bernie Sanders did a YouTube conversation with Cardi B, 14 million people watched it. That was more than the number of people that were watching any of the Democratic debates. Taylor Swift had more Twitter followers than Trump did. So, and then in terms of the comedy, I mean, there were so many, it was such a staple of late night shows that the New York Times started running a column every couple of weeks just chronicling the anti-Trump jokes by the likes of Jimmy Fallon, Jimmy Kimmel, Stephen Colbert, et cetera. So, and then you had the people like Steven Spielberg, who had originally passed on doing the movie about the Pentagon Papers, and the Washington Post struggled with the Nixon Justice Department to publish them. But after Trump was elected, fast-tracked it. David Simon, known as the producer of the great series The Wire, had passed on doing a mini-series about Philip Roth's book, The Plot Against America. But he told me right after Trump won, he changed his mind because he saw an analogy. That's a novel that imagines fascist Hitler sympathizer Charles Lindbergh defeating Franklin Roosevelt in 1940 with the idea that then America would go down the road of the Nazis, and he saw so many parallels to some of the psychology, the demonizing of certain groups for political purpose, that he wanted to bring that to life, and that was aired on HBO during the election year. So I just thought it would be interesting to document it. I think that Trump definitely is a master of mass communication. He's an evil master of it, but there's no question about it. The Apprentice was a top-rated show for years. He got into the heads of the news media, whose ratings went up whenever they talked about him. That's still a problem, I think, in the conventional.
Huge problem, I think. It was a huge problem for us on the Bernie campaign in 2016. You know, we would get crowds of 33,000 people in Portland. Right. Should have been the political story of the decade. And Trump would get a crowd of 10,000, but they couldn't. They'd keep the camera on him for 2-3 hours a night, night after night after night. There was something about the frequency of Trump, you know, the sort of vibrational frequency of Trump's communication that was like catnip to the mass media, to the news media. And he, you know, I think we can agree that very bad person, but he played that kind of masterfully.
Well, look, again, he had 14 years on prime television. So he was branded with a mass audience in a way that no political candidate has been branded, maybe since Bobby Kennedy, you know, or somebody, you know, coming in the wake of JFK's assassination. I mean, he just had a tremendous advantage in terms of the familiarity that tens of millions of people had with him. And it wasn't that he was catnip to the cable news; it's that the ratings were catnip. The ratings went up when you put a TV star on, and they abrogated. Many of us feel a certain degree of objectivity, but you know, they're in business to make money. That's not going to change. We you know, the mass media is not a public service; they're a business, and so the job for people who oppose Trump and Trumpism, because whatever happens with Trump personally, that philosophy has many very wealthy people who support it, and millions of ignorant people who support it. You need a counteracting force. So I just wanted to document this. I wanted to shine a light and kind of broaden the concept of what American politics is. I'm not making an argument against conventional political journalism or academia or the candidates. They are all playing their role, but there are other roles that other people need to play if fascism is going to be defeated. And there's no question in my mind that Biden's victory was the result of a coalition of people that don't always work together, left and center, as well as all different, you know, never Trump Republicans to Bernie, to Susan Sarandon, you know, but it was also that the entertainment community was definitely part of that coalition. And Biden, I give credit for, in his campaign, knew it. Biden himself then did an interview with Cardi B, and that was the week after she'd released the song WAP, which, because you are FCC compliant, I won't say.
Right, you can't, yes, yeah. You can't even discuss the theme of it. But you can't even think about it on this program, Danny, or we'll be kicked off the air.
Very sexually provocative song. And several Republican candidates immediately attacked it and attacked the Democrats for even that Bernie had spoken to her. And, back when Al Gore and Joe Lieberman were running, they were intimidated by that sort of a thing. Not Biden. He embraced, he did 15 minutes with her. He spoke to her audience. She told her Bernie-loving audience that she was now for Biden. I think that helped. I don't think that a piece of art, a song, a joke, or an endorsement is going to make somebody dislike Trump who already liked him. But I do think that you have millions of people that are uncertain about whether or not it's worth voting at all. And I think the level of intensity in the atmosphere drives up turnout. I think that one of the differences between 2016 and 2020 was a tremendous decline in the percentage of people who voted for a third or fourth parties. Right. Libertarian and Green parties combined in 2016 got 5.7% of the vote. In 2020, that was down to 1.7%. That 4%, those are clearly people that have mixed feelings about Democrats, but they voted Democratic because of that sense of urgency. And I think that those were among the people who were susceptible to the atmosphere that people in the arts created, because they're sort of suspicious of conventional political messengers. So again, I don't want to overstate this, and I don't want to pretend that everybody who's an actor or a screenwriter or a singer or songwriter is magically virtuous or brilliant, but I think the community writ large is part of the American political conversation. I think it's going to continue to be that way post-2020 for the next several cycles. I think once people, we had people in 2020 like Robert De Niro and Bette Midler who'd never been particularly politically outspoken before, but they're continuing to be engaged. I think once it gets into someone's sort of psychological DNA, that you can keep your career going, continue to be an artist and have a normal life, but also weigh in on these things, and that you have an audience that's interested in what you have to say. I think it stays with you. Bruce Springsteen was the big star in those No Nukes concerts that I spoke about earlier.
Right.
And when I talked to him for the book, he confirmed to me that was the first time he had ever done anything political. He turned 30 on stage, on one of the shows, and he'd already put out Born to Run and Darkness on the Edge of Town and been on the cover of Time and Newsweek. He'd never said a word politically, but once he did it once, ever since then, it's been part of his persona. I think once people cross that bridge, very few of them turn back. And I think it's healthy that we have a wider group of messengers, because the conventional Democratic messengers, no matter how good they may be as people, are not particularly effective as communicators. Recent history shows us. So I think we need this broader coalition. And I think it's just interesting to document the conversation, and the conversation that kind of gets into the moral issues. Are we all in it for ourselves or our tribe, or are we for the community writ large? Is short-term profit the only thing that matters, or can we think long-term? These are old arguments that go back to Ayn Rand, that go back to other centuries and other societies. Can democracy work, or do we need authoritarianism? And I think that artists are well positioned to participate in those moral arguments. I know there are many immoral artists. There are immoral billionaires too, and politicians and people in religions, but a lot of the people are very sincere. And I think about this stuff and bring something to the conversation.
And, just on that last point, Danny Goldberg, I know a couple of the people profiled in your book. Some of them I've disagreed with on this or that issue, but they're well-intentioned, and I think that counts for a lot in this world. And in reading your book, Danny, I kept thinking, kind of contrasting the last few years with the 60s, going all the way back to John F. Kennedy and the Rat Pack, and how Hollywood kind of coalesced around Kennedy and his glamour and his charisma. And I think it used to drive the Republicans and conservatives crazy at the time, that people were so magnetized by Kennedy and his electric equality. And then the counterculture and civil rights movement, or reverse order, civil rights movement, counterculture came, they had enormous energy. A lot of artists and musicians were gravitated to that. And then it seemed to be there was this long quiet. And as you said a few minutes ago, the right seemed to have more electric energy on its side. However sociopathic and destructive they may be, they have an energy that's undeniable. If you go to a right-wing rally, a Trump rally, as I've done, or you know, some other gatherings of this kind, it's hard to miss that. And if you've been to, you know, 1969 March on Washington, like I have too, it's hard to miss that there is, one is almost like the perverse inverse of the other, right? But there's an electricity there. And so one of the things that interested me or was in my mind in reading your book was, you know, how does this fit into that whole kind of channeling that charisma, that electricity in a new way?
Well, I'm a baby boomer, and I went to that March on Washington too. One of my earlier books was about the year 1967, and I have an enormous amount of emotional connection to some of the music from that period, whether it's Edwin Starr's War or Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Ohio, or like I said, Phil Oakes, or some of the movies, the role Jane Fonda decided to play starting in the early 70s. But I really believe if you look at it analytically, it's a much broader participation since 2016, because in those days you had sort of a certain group of people, Eartha Kitt, like I said, Country Joe and the Fish, Jefferson Airplane, you could list them. But the mainstream pop culture was apolitical. The Smothers Brothers got taken off the air. The one TV show that flirted slightly with the anti-war movement was canceled pretty quickly, even though they had good ratings. And most of the big pop stars, I mean, the Beatles were not political. John Lennon, as a solo artist, was. The Stones were never political. Dylan obviously was at the beginning of his career, but he went through different cycles. And the Motown artists were never political until Edwin Starr did War. And the reason Edwin Starr did it instead of the Temptations was because Berry Gordy didn't want to alienate that part of the Motown audience that supported the war. On the other hand, during the Trump era, and I think going forward, it's a much wider group of creative people. And at the same time, I think it's more important now because of what happened with technology and the fragmentation of the old media. It's a cliche to say, but it's worth repeating and remembering. During the 60s, there were 3 television networks. That was it. That was where people got their news. Now you've got hundreds of things, including things like this. And, network TV news show today will get maybe 1/4 of what they used to get, what Walter Cronkite used to get, 1/5. And so in a fragmented world, somebody who has a few million fans that are interested in what they have to say is relevant in a way that wasn't the case before. On the other hand, the moral arguments are very, very old, not just in America. It goes back to Emile Zola, Harriet Beecher Stowe writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, Leo Tolstoy, Victor Hugo, Aristophanes. You could go back to almost any country, any era, and see that there were creative people that were challenging entrenched power and injustice. There's something about the creative spirit that veers towards the support of underdogs, towards community, and what people politically call the left. Democrats, I think, got scared after McGovern's big loss in 1972. And they got scared politically, and they also got scared culturally. So you had this tension between politically active artists who they liked to show up for fundraisers, but were a little embarrassed to be seen with publicly. And you had a level of communication on the left that was not as emotional and, depended on the president, depended on the year. But from Trump going forward, it's the new world. And I think in this new political world in America, the creative community matters a little bit more, and that doesn't mean they replace expertise or they replace journalism or academia or political consultants, but I think they're an adjunct that our side needs if we're going to compete with, you know, the fact that 8 of the top 10 Facebook posts every day are by extreme right wingers.
Yeah, that's huge, and that kind of speaks to a technology that drives a certain kind of discourse, right? So, in that sense, in that communications struggle, we have one hand and 4 fingers of the other tied behind our back, trying to, because the media, social media, are designed for conflict and not even for positive statements of liberation. You know, I mean, it's just
there's a huge investment on the part of the right in, you know, I get dozens and dozens of right-wing emails a day, blabberbuzz or something with their talking points. I'm not sure that's a profitable venture, but
I doubt it.
There are these billionaires who believe in this populist sort of advertising, brainwashing communication. And, you know, the billionaires on our side have been a little more about, you know, getting op-eds in the New York Times. And believe me, I would love to write an op-ed for the New York Times, and I read the New York Times every day, but most people don't.
Right. Right. And I think that let's talk a little bit about, can you hear me, Danny? Are we still communicating here?
I think so.
Okay, good. Let's talk a little bit about race and how race fits into this. You know, you mentioned at a couple of points, you mentioned the film Black Panther, which, look, I'm not black. I saw Black Panther in the theater and I felt exhilarated. You know, I think it must have been, I think it was a powerful cultural force. I think, you know, you mentioned a couple of other films. I think you have sort of the entertainment world that you describe. It's multi-track. Certainly black artists have large white audiences and so on. But it seems to me that the cloud or the influence that a hip-hop artist brings, for example, is different than the cloud or influence that a Robert De Niro brings, or, you know, somebody, Meryl Streep.
Very, very much. Well, there's a few different things hacked into that question. Just to focus for a minute on hip-hop, I don't, there's no question in my mind that I think a lot of black academics and others agree that the last 25 years or so of hip hop lyrics focusing on racist police practices reached a white audience that otherwise would not have been aware of it. This is been the pop music of the last couple of generations, you know. You know, when Rodney King was beaten up and that video was on TV, there were demonstrations, but they were almost all black. And in the wake of George Floyd's murder, the demonstrations were both more widespread and were integrated, because I think people had internalized. There was a whole couple of generations of white people that had internalized some of the underlying issues. I think there's also been a tradition in the black political world to value the role of arts and entertainment more than sort of the white left does. John Lewis talked about R&B as being the soundtrack of the civil rights movement. Julian Bond used to give lectures about the importance of R&B and rock and roll in the civil rights era. And, you know, people like Ava DuVernay are integrated with kind of the black political agenda in a different way. There's also the phenomenon of the business part of it, which is, look, entertainment business is a business and has the same level of greed and creepiness as any other big business, but they're interested in the entire population, and they're particularly interested in younger people. There's voter suppression, but there's not suppression about who streams a movie or who listens to a song. And so the center of gravity in the entertainment world is younger and hence much more progressive. I don't have to tell you what the people under 30 support for Bernie compared to people over 60 was like, you know, double the percentage. And so I think that into that context, even though there has been institutional racism in the entertainment business, and a lot of it was explored after the murder of George Floyd, and I have a whole chapter called, you know, Hollywood looks at itself in the mirror about the realization of some racism within that community. That said, it's long been a place where blacks could compete and reach white audiences in a way that was only rivaled by sports. And the importance in music is overwhelming. Blues and R&B and rock and roll all started as black art forms. And in films, it's a growing phenomenon on these streaming series and all that sort of a thing. And those voices reach people, again, that don't necessarily watch the evening news or political debate. And in terms of just evolving the moral conversation about race, I do think arts and entertainment play a unique role. And I think most black leaders agree with that. Again, there's always been kind of a snobbishness and a diffidence on the part of a lot of liberal elites and Democrats worrying, is this going to alienate somebody in middle America? You just never hear any of that from black political leaders. Obviously, the 2020 election cycle was dominated by two gigantic issues. One was COVID, and the other was the murder of George Floyd. Yeah. So, therefore, the role of black artists, and this is in the wake of Donald Trump, whose main identification prior to the election was accusing Barack Obama of not having been born in America.
Right.
Why that called for
and the Central Park Five
Central Park Five. Yeah. People that were exonerated, he had called for their execution and never backed away from that, even after they were exonerated. When I say exonerated, someone else confessed to the crime and it was proved by DNA. It wasn't just a body. Yeah. And Ava DuVernay produced a 5-part miniseries called The Central Park Five that was aired. I'm spacing out whether it was Netflix or HBO. During the 2020 cycle that included, it was a dramatization, but it included actual footage of Trump from the 80s, calling these kids to be killed and saying that it was an advantage and not a disadvantage to be black in America in the 80s. It's a pretty powerful, several powerful hours of entertainment. And again, I don't think that kind of thing necessarily changes people's minds about where they are in the spectrum of ideology, but I do think it changes their minds about the urgency of participating in an election. And I
think that's exactly right. Intensity of
this is an era where all the political scientists say, although there is some persuasion going on, and they talk about women in the suburbs, white women in the suburbs, and do we lose them? Do we win them? I think that's a real conversation, and I respect people who are concerned about that in politics, but I think there's even a larger number of younger people and people of color and people that are so-called low information voters, that whether or not they decide to vote depends on the outcome of the election. And one of the main reasons Biden won is because of the massive turnout.
And you've got to really motivate them, because our racist voting system makes it so hard, especially for black voters, to vote in so many states, that they really have to work hard to get out to vote. And if you don't offer them something that's worth missing a shift at work or whatever, they're not going to do it. No. That's critical. And I, on this discussion has gone so quickly that unfortunately we're running out of time. But before we close this part of it, I do want to say also that your observation is maybe one of the reasons why I feel that energy that I've been looking for, that where I feel it most is in black art, black music these days, today, that there's that urgency, that whether it's, over the past 5, 6, 7 years, whether it's Childish Gambino's This Is America video, whether it's Beyonce dancing on the roof of a sinking police car, whether it's Ava DuVernay's work, whether it's Fruitvale Station, and they're just in the films. It's just, that's, to me, maybe I'm an old hippie, but I need the vibe, I need the charge, I need the energy, and more importantly than me, I feel that's what we need to overcome exactly what you've just described, which is the motivation to get people to resist the barriers that are being put up so that they can not only vote but participate. But I'll leave the final words to you.
Well, I would just add to that the other strain. People used to call, and John Lewis called, music the soundtrack of the '60s. I think comedy has been the soundtrack of the Trump and post-Trump years. I think there's something about the ability of a comedian to turn around something in the news and be humorous right away. I think you look at the role Jimmy Kimmel played in terms of helping preserve Obamacare, after his son was born needing open heart surgery that would not be available to poor people until the Affordable Care Act. I think that's part of the mix too. Anyway, it's nerve-wracking to be alive now. I empathize with my kids who have to deal with climate change and other issues. But I also think that we are the majority. And as long as our coalition can stay together, and artists are part of that, even though we don't have a system that's actually democratic in many respects, there are democratic elements there. And to the extent that people stay engaged, I think ultimately we can prevent the disaster of a resurgence of Trumpism.
Well, that's the best way to conclude I can think of. So, Danny Goldberg, and again, Danny is my guest. And again, the name of the book, I want to get it exactly right. Bloody Crossroads. What's the subtitle? Bloody
Crossroads 2020, which is an allusion to some old intellectual arguments of the 40s and 50s. Bloody Crossroads 2020, Art, Entertainment, and Resistance to Trump. Available at bookstores now.
At anywhere but Amazon. Go buy it now. And so, Danny Goldberg, thanks for writing.
You can buy it on Amazon too, whatever their political problems are. But
for you, we'll make an exception.
I like independent bookstores myself.
I do too, but for you, we'll make an exception. So, Danny, thanks for writing it, and thanks as always for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.